Now that we have implemented a login page, and we have also covered where the security context is stored, we're ready to implement the verifications with credentials as well as generating the security context. So let's jump into Visual Studio and start implementing those logic. So first of all, we need to make sure that we do have our credentials. And for that, we'll need to check our model state to see whether it's valid or not. And if it's not valid, we are going to return. And then next, we want to verify the credentials. And we are not going to connect to the database. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the security aspect of that. So that's why we're just hard-coding the verification process here. So I want to make sure that the username is admin and the password is password. So as long as we have these two match the username and password, then we're okay. The next step, right? So here we verify the credential, right? And then the second step here, we are creating the security context, right? And if we go back to our diagram that we drew before, we will need to create a bunch of claims, and then we'll add to the identity. We only need one identity, which is the primary identity. Once we have the primary identity, we add it to the claims principal, and we are done with creating the security context. Right? So for that, we'll instantiate a list of claims. And I'm doing Control Dot to import the namespace here. And then, of course, we are going to add, let's add some claims here. Right, so we're gonna have a name, and let's call it just admin, and perhaps we'll add another one. We'll add another claim, and let's see what options do we have here. Do we have an email? Yeah, we have an email. Let's say admin at mywebsite.com. Right, that's good enough. Now that we have the claims, we have mentioned the claims are just a pair of attributes, right? And with that, we need to add those claims to a identity. So now we need to declare and instantiate the identity. And what we need is a claims identity, which we can add the claims to it. And then here, what we want to have is the authentication type. The authentication type. Let's give it a name, and then I'm going to talk about this later. Right? So we're going to use cookie authentication, which is the typical type of authentication for a login page. Right? Let's call it my cookie, like my cookie authentication. Right? And you can give it whatever name you want. So once we have the identity, then what we need is a claims principal. I mean, to instantiate that, and it can be empty, but you can also provide a primary identity. You can also provide this primary identity here. So now we have this security context within the claims principal, right? We have learned that the principal contains the security context. Now, what we need to do, we can see that we generate the security context, but then next step is we need to encrypt and serialize the security context, and then it can go into the cookie, right? But we don't need to do that ourselves. We can use the HTTP context object. It has a sign in async method here, which is an extension method. You can see it's an extension method. It comes from the ASP.NET Core HTTP namespace. Right, so we can do that. And here, we also want to specify the authentication scheme, which is the authentication type. And we want this authentication type to be exactly the same as this one. right? And then here we can provide the principal as the second parameter, right? So we're going to put in the claims principal here. Since this is async, right? So we need to await it. And because of that, what we need to do is we'll change this to a task, and it has to be an async task. And because of that, we'll also make this one async. So this one is supposed to, what it does is that it's going to serialize the claims principal into a string and then encrypt that string, save that as a cookie in the HTTP context, right? Into the cookie inside HTTP context object. And if everything is good, then we're going to redirect to a page. So let's just redirect to the index page, right? You can see that this redirect to a page, it actually returns the redirect to page result. So because of that, we are going to, instead of making this a void, we're going to make it return iAction result. Of course, here, what we can do here, we have to fix it. We can return the page result here. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to basically return the view, right? So this one is going to find the index view and return the index view, right? When we return the page result, we're returning the login.cs HTML, right? Which is the CS HTML object. And if the verification failed, then it will fall out of this branch. And again, we're going to return a page, okay? So let's build this solution and then let's run it, right? So because we did not configure authorization, that's why I did not redirect us to the login page directly, but we can go to the login page, right? And then we can type in the password. And if I type in something that is wrong, so it will return directly back to the login page, which is this one, right? But if I input the correct password, then watch what happens. It throws exception. So let's look into this exception. See, it says that no sign-in authentication handlers are registered. Did you forget to call the @authentication @cookie? It tells you exactly what you need to do here. But before we actually do this, let's try to understand what is actually happening here. Right? It says that on this line, there's something is wrong. So what exactly is wrong here, right? Let's read this error message again. It says there's no sign-in authentication handlers. Authentication handlers. So this is the keyword, authentication handlers, right? So what is actually happening is that this HTTP context sign-in async, under the hood, it uses the authentication handler, which is provided to this through the iAuthentication service interface. Okay, so let's take a look at the iAuthentication service interface. See, this interface contains the abstraction of several methods, right? There is this sign-in async, which is exactly the one that we're missing, right? It contains sign out, challenge, forbid, and authenticate. So these are the abstractions of the authentication handlers, right? So what is complaining here is that the HTTP context.sign async is trying to use the iAuthentication service interface, but it cannot find any concrete implementation of that interface. So we are missing, we don't have the handlers here. And it asks you to inject, right? So this is the dependency injection under the configure services, right? It asks you to inject the implementation of those handlers. Let's take a step back and see what is actually happening here as from the design pattern point of view, right? So let's see this, let's use this printf in a C language, for example, right? Usually this printf will print to the console, to your screen. So this is the output. The printf will output to the console. But if you use different libraries, it can go to the console, right? It can also go to, let's say, a printer, right? It can go to any other I/O devices. What is actually happening under the hood is that the printf is not talking to these devices directly. What it's actually talking to is an abstraction of the I/O devices. In C++, this would be an abstract class. So these drivers implement the abstraction. And then as long as you import the libraries of the corresponding drivers, then you are able to print to a console or printer or other devices, right? So what this printf is really talking to is this abstraction. So this kind of design pattern, is basically it's everywhere. It's typically when you have some I/O devices. You don't want to lock your library to a particular output device, right? You don't want to, for example, you don't want to lock your output to just SQL Server database, right? By locking to a specific SQL Server database library. You want to talk to an interface and then develop all of these as plugins. So in our case, it's the same situation here. We are having a bunch of authentication and authorization. In this case, we're talking about authentication, right? We're having some requirements for authentication, and it needs to serialize the information, right? The security context to either a cookie or a token or something else. They are kind of like a I/O thing. It's outside the application boundary. It's under the HTTP protocol, right? So the security context can be stored or can be serialized to either a cookie or a token or something else. You don't want to lock yourself to just a cookie or just a token like this, right? You don't want to directly talk to it. So what you actually want to do is you want to do a similar thing, right? So inside your application, right? So let's use this this square or rectangle as a boundary for your application. Inside it, you want to talk to a abstraction, right? And this is the authentication service. This interface in C#, it contains the abstraction of all of your needs for authentication, right? So your actual authentication will just talk to this abstraction, and then the cookies or tokens, the different authentication handlers, as long as it implements this authentication service, then the only thing as a developer what you need to do is to tell the ASP.NET Core that either you want a cookie authentication handler to be injected, or a token authentication handler to be injected, or both, right? Or both. And that's where the authentication scheme name or the authentication type name come into play, right? That name comes into play because it can be this or this, right? Cookie or token or both. Because there can be multiple authentication handlers that implements the authentication service, we want to give them different names so that we can distinguish, right? ASP.NET Core can distinguish which is which. We can use the name to group the cookie, the security context, which is the principal entities, and the authentication handler itself together. And that's why we need to specify the name everywhere. And what is that name? That is the authentication scheme or the authentication type, which you have seen when I was implementing it. So let's jump into Visual Studio and see how we implement these, right? And it's actually very clear here. It's actually telling you, you need to add authentication. You need to do this. So let's copy this and let's stop debugging and let's go into our startup where we can find this server configure services. This is where we want to inject our authentication handler. So over here, what we want to do is, I'm gonna paste this over here, right? So we're gonna do this services.add. So basically we're adding services to a collection. You can see this is a service collection interface here, right? We're adding this authentication handler to the to the service collection. And this add cookie is adding the cookie authentication handler, right? This means that all of the implementations for encrypting and serializing the security context will be injected into ASP.NET Core by just calling this extension method, which is implemented by ASP.NET Core, right? So we don't have to specifically implement how this encryption, decryption, serializing, deserializing works. We just need to add this cookie authentication handler. All we have to be really taking care of is to give it a name, right? We can give our own name. We can, yeah, it's just a string, right? So, and then here, let's take a look at the second parameter here, which is the options. So we want to also make sure we configure our options correctly here. And in here, there's a lot of different things we can configure, right? But at this moment, the most important thing is that we need to configure our cookie, and especially our cookie name. We want this to be just like that. So this specifies the cookie name, which is the most important aspect in the cookie authentication. By doing so, you specify target of the serialization, and ASP.NET Core knows which cookie contains the authentication security context. Right, so let's, at this moment, only configure the cookie name here. And then we can see that we have been very careful of using the same name, right, in the cookie name, in the authentication scheme name, as well as in the identity. Associate this cookie name with the identity and provide this cookie or the authentication scheme name to the sign-in, where they are all the same name, so that we can kind of logically group them together. Of course, the best practice here is to declare a constant, right? I'm not going to do that. When we actually implement a solution, we should actually declare a constant for this in case we have some typos. Right, so let's run the solution again. Okay, I'm going to bring up the developer tool, right, by pressing F12. And then I'm going to go to, right, clicking on this double arrow, and then I go to applications. I want to look at the cookies, right? So go under cookies, right, open this up, and then go into this domain, right? Cookies are always associated with specific domains. So we're looking at this domain, so that's why we have to go under this domain. And we can see that we don't have my cookie auth, the cookie name. We only have this by default. We have this anti-forgery a cookie here, right? So we don't have our cookie yet, but let's watch what's happening here. So let's go into provide the correct username and password, and then let's watch whether we're gonna have a cookie or not. All right. So you can see that we have a cookie, right? We have a cookie, so this is all encrypted, right, and serialized. So this contains our security context, which is the claims principal. But we can't see anything because it's really encrypted within this domain. And where does the cookie come from? That comes from here. So this HTTP context.sign async is triggered, and it talks to the authentication service interface. And who has implemented that interface? That what we have chosen to inject into our ASP.NET Core by calling add cookie. So this cookie authentication handler is injected, and we have configured to take this authentication scheme name, right? And we made sure we're using the same authentication scheme name. We grouped them all together. And so that when we trigger this method, it uses the cookie authentication handler that we have injected into ASP.NET Core, taking this name. And finally, we can see that ClaimsPrincipal security context is created over here, taking the cookie name. Okay, so let's recap. What we have done today is we input username and password. We implemented this verification process, and we implemented the generating process, right? We generate the security context within the claims principal. We injected the cookie authentication handlers, right? And we successfully created the cookie. So the cookie is now sent back to the browser. We saw that in the browser developer tool. So in the next video, we are going to follow this line to see whether we have the cookie deserialized and decrypted. I'll see you in the next one.